This is the sound of your ride home with Dad after he caught you vaping. Awkward, isn't it? Most vapes contain seriously addictive levels of nicotine and disappointment. Know the real cost of vapes. Brought to you by the FDA.
Hey, it's Eric Erickson. I got something a little different for you today. It's actually another podcast I think you're going to like, America on Trial by my good buddy Josh Hammer, who's also a lawyer. He covers the 2024 presidential election through the only lens that really matters right now, the legal proceedings of Donald Trump and Hunter Biden. Josh Hammer examines breaking news and analyzes the biggest questions in American history that'll go all the way to the Supreme Court and ultimately decide the next president of the United States. America on Trial covers all the action every day. Today, you can listen to an episode of America on Trial right here. So, this is America on Trial with Josh Hammer.
I'm Josh Hammer, and this is America on Trial, your one-stop shop for all your legal news pertaining to the 2024 presidential election and all the major pressing legal headlines affecting our country and our endangered American way of life. On today's show, we take a deep dive into where else but the criminal prosecution of Donald J. Trump in New York City. Michael Cohen is taking the witness stand once again today after his testimony yesterday. What does all of it mean? This is the prosecution's so-called star witness. Is any of this going to matter legally speaking? Is it going to affect the jury one way or the other? We'll talk about Michael Cohen's testimony in today's deep dive. And then later on the show, in today's closing argument section, the House Republicans, the Oversight and Judiciary Committees in particular, are planning to hold Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress this week. He is the Attorney General of the United States. This is for his Department of Justice's refusal to turn over the full audio recordings of former special counsel Robert Hur's investigation and his interviews with President Joe Biden. Interesting separation of powers dispute from a constitutional perspective. I'll get into all of that in today's closing argument. But for now, as always, we begin by going around the horn. We begin in New York City / New Jersey, really, because we're talking here about the corruption trial of New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez. Wow. So this is Bob Menendez's second corruption trial in the past decade. Who can forget his previous exploits pertaining to the Dominican Republic? It seemed like that there were some hookers down there. He was ultimately acquitted from his complicity in that particular scheme back in 2017 after there was a mistrial in the federal courthouse in New Jersey. But jury selection has started. Jury selection got underway yesterday in Manhattan Federal Courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Bob Menendez was there physically in court. Bob Menendez has announced that he is not seeking an additional term for his U.S. Senate perch from the Garden State, but he has not necessarily ruled out running as independent. He's basically just said, I'm not going to seek the Democratic Party's nomination, but rather he is still holding out the possibility of running as an independent. This seems to me, from a very superficial look at what we have seen evidence-wise, like Bob Menendez has been caught fairly red-handed or gold-handed, as the case may be, when you talk about the literal gold bars stuffed in linen and wool suits that were found in his closet from the Egyptian government. What a ridiculous corruption story. Obviously, the prosecutorial threshold is beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's way too early to draw any objective conclusions here, but this looks really bad for Bob Menendez, and there is a reason that he has announced that he is no longer going to seek the New Jersey Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate. Curious, I would say, that he has not actually stepped down and resigned from his seat to begin with. From New Jersey / New York down to Washington, D.C., interesting headline from Politico overnight that caught my eye. Top U.S. Department of Justice officials have promised to respond swiftly to threats against those overseeing this year's election. And essentially what the DOJ is doing is that they are announcing that they're going to aggressively increase their efforts to combat technology when it comes to disrupting the electoral process. So basically, this amounts to a full spectrum attempt from the Biden Department of Justice to try to crack down on any alleged suppression of the vote. Now, there are potentially some problems here, and simultaneously, it's worth pointing out, that the House Oversight Committee, led by Congressman Jim Comer of Kentucky, simultaneously, the House Oversight Committee is actually probing the Biden administration's executive order when it comes to a closely related voter mobilization effort. This is Executive Order 14019 on so-called promoting access to voting. They're looking into it to see whether there are any legal problems there. These two stories closely relate to one another. Long story short, what's going on here is the Biden DOJ is really trying to aggressively tap down on anything that remotely sniffs of trying to suppress or to snuff out the franchise, your right to vote. But the problem is that we know that there is a very fine line when it comes to actual illegal conduct to snuff out the vote and prudent measures to safeguard electoral security and integrity. So if the Biden DOJ is focused here on nefarious AI tools and foreign influence, then I don't really have a huge issue with it. If it starts to bleed over into legitimate efforts to safeguard electoral integrity, then I possibly have a huge effort with it. We will keep tabs of that for you as we move forward here on America on Trial. Finally, I wanted to touch on a story that I saw in Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Supreme Court has essentially signaled that it is returning ballot drop boxes to the very crucial swing state of Wisconsin. The state of Wisconsin is currently one of the swingiest states in America. That was an absolute nail-biter in 2020. It was a very close election in 2016 as well. It really is one of the three Rust Belt states, along with Michigan and Pennsylvania, that is most up in the air right now when it comes to the 2024 election. Donald Trump, per yesterday's New York Times Siena College poll, is currently up 1 point on Joe Biden there in the state of Wisconsin. Recall that it was last year in 2023 that liberals took control of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Again, Democrats, liberals, progressives, whatever you want to call them, they're fairly interchangeable here, even though it's not technically partisan judicial elections. You have Milwaukee County Circuit Judge Janet Protasevich, I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. She was elected to replace the retiring conservative there on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And at the time, I and many others said, this is really important. This is a crucial state Supreme Court in a crucial swing state coming up to a presidential election year. This is going to be really important, I said at that time, when it comes to ballot access, when it comes to electoral integrity, when it comes to voter ID, when it comes to drop boxes, ballot harvesting. I and many others were saying that. Unfortunately, conservatives did not show up in that judicial election. They got their clocks cleaned in it. Janet won by a huge double-digit or close to that margin. She ran heavily on the abortion issue. And now, what do you know? The chickens are coming home to roost, and Wisconsin's Supreme Court is saying that it's going to put drop boxes back in. So hopefully that's not going to have too big of a difference when it comes to the actual election, but really it remains to be seen. But a potentially somewhat troubling update for you when it comes to the state of Wisconsin. That's it for today's Round the Horn segment. Up next in today's deep dive, as we mentioned, we're going to go back to the New York City courtroom of Justice Juan Merchan and talk about Michael Cohen's testimony, which was yesterday and is continuing today. What is going on there? Does any of this matter legally speaking? All of that and more when we come back. Welcome back. It's time for today's deep dive. So after so much anticipation, the prosecution's so-called star witness, Michael Cohen, finally took the witness stand yesterday in the first ever criminal prosecution of a former president of the United States, people of the state of New York versus Donald J. Trump. And he has taken the stand once again today. And Michael Cohen is a character, and it is worth unpacking what he is saying. It is worth unpacking whether or not any of this matters, legally speaking, and it actually helps the prosecution prove its theory of the case. I guess it's probably worth unpacking who Michael Cohen is. Michael Cohen has been in Donald Trump's circles for a very long time. He has been officially with Donald Trump going as far back as 2006, arguably informally even further than that. He reached a height of vice president of the Trump organization. He was also personal counsel to Donald Trump himself back when Donald Trump was in the private sector. And Michael Cohen has often been described, sometimes by himself in his own words, as Donald Trump's fixer. Now, Donald Trump has a history, you might say, of being surrounded by some people with slightly less than fully reputable reputations. Who can forget Roy Cohn? going back many decades ago. Roger Stone comes to mind as well here. But Michael Cohen in particular ended up pleading guilty to 8 counts in the year 2018, 8 counts entailing tax fraud, bank fraud, and get this, campaign finance violations. Yes, the guy who is now being touted as the prosecution's star witness trying to impugn Donald Trump and to help the prosecution prove its threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt, meet its prosecutorial burden, that Donald Trump violated the federal campaign finance laws. The so-called star witness, Michael Cohen, is someone himself who pled guilty to, among other things, violating the campaign finance laws. It really is kind of a Kafka-esque affair. Michael Cohen ended up being sentenced to 3 years in federal prison in order to pay a $50,000 fine. He was disbarred from practicing law. He ended up serving a prison sentence for about 2.5 years. He was in and out of house arrests and halfway houses and things like that. So he is the prosecution's so-called star witness. So right off the bat, you recognize that you have a problem here. He is an admitted liar and a convicted felon, someone who admitted that he lied to congressional committee investigators during the course of the Russia investigation and other related investigations as well here. So let's talk about what Michael Cohen actually said at this trial. Michael Cohen yesterday said that what he basically told reporters and journalists in 2018, 2019 was incorrect. So back in 2018, 2019, back around the time that he was pleading guilty to the counts that I just discussed, he essentially told journalists and investigators alike that the Trump Organization and Donald Trump had nothing to do with these payments that he had made to Stormy Daniels on the precipice of the 2016 election. Now, Michael Cohen is saying, oh, forget about what I said 5-6 years ago or so. I was lying back then. Now I'm telling the truth. And now when I tell the truth, it turns out, and this is what Michael Cohen said in court yesterday, quote, everything required Mr. Trump's sign-off. So now he's saying that Donald Trump was actually deeply involved. Michael Cohen says that he quoted Donald Trump as saying, quote, we need to stop this from getting out. That referring to the Stormy Daniels account of the 2006 alleged one-night affair. Michael Cohen even says that he apparently surreptitiously secretly recorded his client, secretly recorded Donald Trump. Now, look, I'm a lawyer myself. I don't recall learning that one in law school. A lawyer who secretly records his own client against that client's knowledge. That is a new trick, to put it mildly there. Anyone who is caught doing that, any lawyer, should be disbarred or at a bare minimum sanctioned. Yet again, this is the prosecution's so-called star witness. But I really just want to underscore one thing here, which is that, again, as I've explained on this show, in order to show a violation of the federal campaign finance laws, you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt, because that's the criminal threshold everywhere, you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that the money in question went to the man or woman to aid his or her political campaign, and the money went for that purpose for the sole, exclusive, and unambiguous reason of helping that individual get across the political finish line. Put another way, if Donald Trump's lawyers can sow any seeds of doubt whatsoever and possibly introduce into evidence the notion that there might have been mixed motives for this money, that there might have been other reasons for these payments to be made, that perhaps Donald Trump wanted to shield his son Barron Trump from embarrassment, that perhaps Donald Trump wanted to safeguard his marriage, perhaps he just wanted to protect Melania Trump. If his lawyers can sow any seeds of doubt like that, then this case necessarily fails. Even if Michael Cohen has, let's say hypothetically, Michael Cohen can produce this hypothetical smoking gun, which is a recording where Donald Trump is caught in a hot mic basically saying, pay off the woman, I want her to go away so that I can beat Hillary Clinton. Even if they have that, that is not sufficient. Because the fact that he said this in like a one-off recording, and again, this is assuming for the sake of argument that Michael Cohen can even produce this recording, that is not going to cut it. Because again, the fact that he is caught in a one-off moment saying this does not necessarily mean that he couldn't have been doing it for additional other reasons as well. So I think that something much more is that there. And one final point that I've also made at times over the past few months here is that let's recall that this is Donald Trump. This is the guy who was in Iowa in early 2016 talking about 2 Corinthians, not 2 Corinthians. This is someone who, around the time that the Stormy Daniels payment was being made, the whole NBC News Billy Bush video came out. This is someone who infamously in Trump Tower, New York City, has the Playboy magazine covers hanging all around up there. This is someone whose personal private life has been the subject of New York tabloid excitement and headlines for quite literally decades on end. This is not someone who was necessarily running for office as a Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee, Ben Carson-esque pious, church-going Christian conservative. So you have to ask yourself, if it's that clear what Donald Trump's appeal is, which is this blue-collar, working-class appeal when it comes to trade, immigration, much of which I'm sympathetic to, but if that is the appeal and it's not the fact that he is a man of personal piety, then would it really make sense for him to go this far to make the woman go away solely to help his electoral chances? I say no, because it's already baked into the equation there. So I'm going to be very curious to see whether or not Trump's lawyers try to make that admittedly somewhat counterintuitive argument when it comes to possible witnesses of their own. I think not, but it's a very intriguing possibility. In any event, all this is to say, I have thus far seen nothing yet when it comes to Michael Cohen that I think is necessarily going to tip the scales to the prosecution when it comes to the black letter law. Obviously, juries ultimately can do what juries do. That's it for today's deep dive. Up next in today's closing argument, looks like the House Oversight and Judiciary Committees are going to hold Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress. What is going on there? Well, we will unpack it for you in today's closing argument. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. It's time for today's closing argument. So it looks like we're going to have a separation of powers showdown. So the House Oversight and Judiciary Committees this Thursday are planning to hold the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, in contempt of Congress due to his failure to produce subpoenaed audio recording of President Biden's interview with former special counsel Robert Hur. So the House Oversight and Judiciary Committees have seen the transcript. They have seen the transcript of special counsel Robert Hur's his interview with President Joe Biden, but they have not actually heard the audio recording. And thus far, Merrick Garland is refusing to provide the audio files here because he's saying that I have not seen a legitimate investigative purpose and that it is important from a law enforcement executive branch perspective to safeguard all investigative materials here. This is not something that we hand over willy-nilly. So it's a legitimate separation of powers showdown. Congress has its subpoena power, including when it comes to the executive branch, but the executive branch does have its own reasons here. They have various types of privileges as well here. So we're going to have to see what happens. And ultimately, I do side with the House and Judiciary Committees here and what they're doing. I don't buy Merrick Garland's argument that there's no legitimate investigative reason to hear the audio recording. What are you talking about? Simultaneously, Congressman Jim Comer of Kentucky, who heads up the Oversight Committee, he is still technically plodding forward with his impeachment hearing of Joe Biden. They have not formally dropped that investigative process yet. It's not an impeachment hearing, it's an impeachment inquiry. Pardon my language there. But the impeachment inquiry has not actually been dropped yet. And you would certainly think that the audio recording of special counsel Robert Hur, when it comes to Joe Biden's grossly negligent, at a bare minimum, mishandling of classified documents, you would definitely think that hearing the audio recording would be potentially relevant legally and politically when it comes to this ongoing impeachment inquiry that Congressman Comer is simultaneously presiding over at a bare minimum. So I don't really buy Merrick Garland's rationale here, but ultimately this is a separation of powers dispute. We don't have great mechanisms in our constitutional structure for ultimately reconciling such separation of powers conflicts short of the U.S. Supreme Court, which I guess is one possible way for this to ultimately unfold. But if I had to guess, I do think that someone's ultimately going to blink first here. This strikes me as something of a very high-stakes game of chicken. Well, thanks as always for tuning in to America on Trial with Josh Hammer. I am your host, Josh Hammer. Tune in today, tomorrow, every day for all the latest in our legal headlines. Enjoy your day, everyone. We'll be right back tomorrow morning.